This is Duke University.
This evening we are here for this wonderful program entitled Our Stories, Your Legacy, a dialogue with SNCC veterans. And we are joined by this esteemed panel of veterans of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. To my far left is Judy Richardson, Mr. Charlie Cobb, and Ms. Maria Varela, who the three of which have been extremely integral in the work that's presently being done here on campus to create a digital gateway, which in essence will be a documentary website that will attempt to tell a broad and in-depth story of SNCC. Charlie and Judy have been a part of the project, our pilot project, which is the One Person, One Vote, SNCC and the legacy of voting rights. And for the past year or so, a little over a year, and Maria has joined us as a visiting documentarian for this specific semester. So we are extremely fortunate to have this well of knowledge, and the three of them all share something in common, which we'll get to down the line. You all don't even know what that is.
You're right.
Yeah, that's why I'm driving the car.
That's right. That's right.
So before we get started, I want to make sure that we give a shout out to the co-sponsors for this evening: the Forum for Scholars in Public, the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, the Center for Documentary Studies, the Department of History here at Duke, the Duke Human Rights Center, and our very own John Hope Franklin Research Center. Shocking. So again, thank you all for your wonderful support of the project as well as the program for this evening.
I came out of Swarthmore College, Quaker College, came through Cambridge, Maryland, the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and it turned out that was a SNCC-affiliated project. Ended up at the national office, and this would have been 1963. And it was my first year. It was my freshman year. I was on a full four-year scholarship at Swarthmore. Thought I would come out in sociology. And I should tell you that my mother had made it through 8th grade. My father had organized the UAW local at the plant, the Chevrolet plant in Tarrytown. So this was a big thing for me to be at Swarthmore's campus. I come into the national office, and I'm thinking that I'm going to go back to Cambridge at some point. But then Jim Foreman, the executive secretary, finds out that I can type 90 words a minute, that I can take what is known as then was Greg shorthand, which is like texting but with symbols, and that I could write a literate English sentence. So I never make it back, and I become his secretary, which was the best thing that could have happened to me, because I get a bird's eye view when I first come in of all of the pieces that this national office is helping to coordinate, all in service to the work. So there's the research department. There's the communications department with Julian Bond, right, typing with very quickly. He could type quicker with 2 fingers than I could type with all 10 of mine. They're doing press releases. There's Dinky Romilly, who is doing the northern support of all of the Friends of SNCC on the campuses, and the coordination with the main New York office, and all the Friends of SNCC, which were the adult groups all over the country. So that in the same way that you have Twitter and Facebook now and stuff, we had what was called the WATS line, and that was the Wide Area Telephone Service, WATS. And so when somebody got arrested, you could then contact everyone. So what happens is that, and then I found out about the pro bono lawyers in New York and all the people who are working all over this place, all in support of the various field staff that are in Alabama and Mississippi and Southwest Georgia and Arkansas. So I come in not knowing anything, and I suddenly are knee-deep in this amazing coordination. I see Ruby Doris Robinson, who really did run the office. And all of that is happening, and I'm at that point 18 years old. So I work in the national office for a while. Then I go to Mississippi when we moved the entire national office to Greenwood, Mississippi. That summer of 1964, which is when those three particular civil rights workers were killed basically by the deputy sheriff and the sheriff. And so that was the summer of 64 when we were building the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, going to the Democratic Convention. I get from there to Lowndes County, Alabama, and then to Southwest Georgia, in Cordele, Georgia, and then I get called out from Lowndes County to go work on Julian Bond's first successful campaign for the Georgia House of Representatives, which Charlie and one of our co-colleagues from SNCC ran. They ran that campaign like a SNCC organizing campaign. So it was run as a grassroots campaign, not bringing your agenda in, but saying, okay, now what do you want to happen? So that's, I'm sorry. So, okay, that's when we're imprint. It changed the whole life. I mean, it changed my entire life. It changed who I was, who I wanted to be. I found out that you could be another way. That you could be, as a female, as a Black female in this country, you could be another way. And so I don't go into sociology, and then I start working for, not that that's a bad thing. We need sociologists, okay. But I decided that wasn't what I needed to do. Yes. Say what? Friends are sociologists, that's right. And then but what I bring is the skills that I learned in SNCC to when I become the first employee, first full-time staff person for what becomes Eyes on the Prize. And at that point, it was going to be a 1-hour documentary. It's 1979. I move up to Boston, and who knew it would be 14 hours? 1 hour. I helped change the title because I hated the title. And Henry Hampton, the head of it, had a title which was called America, We Loved You Madly. Okay, and that's because he loved the play on words of madly, right? So it turned out that Duke Ellington, the big, wonderful band leader, at the end of a concert would come out at the end of the stage and would say to the audience, "I love you madly." Okay, so Henry loved this. I hated it. I hated it from jump. So I have, which I won't go through here, I have the series writer sent this to me a few years ago. And it's what I say when a staff finally gets hired. And it begins, "Dear staff," and my first line is, "Y'all know how much I hate the current working title." So now I'm saying this against the person who signs my checks, hello. And by the way, I knew nothing about film when I get in. So I said, so here are freedom songs. First lines, titles, choose one. And I start with, This is a Lot of Mine. I have, Woke Up This Morning. Number 6 is Keep Your Eyes on the Prize. And then I have 26. And at the very end, I have an asterisk, and that's number 27. And it says, we sang and prayed, and they beat the hell out of us anyway. Asterisk, my personal favorite. Now, he doesn't choose that one. He chooses number 6. So I go through that. I do film. I do documentary film. I go through, so I get into documentary film, and I take the skills of the movement with me.
Just work down the line.
As a Howard University student in Washington, D.C. in 1961, I became involved in the sit-in movement on the eastern shore of Maryland and along Route 40 in Maryland with the Howard SNCC affiliate, the Nonviolent Action Group. Because I was involved with these sit-ins, at the end of the semester core, the Congress of Racial Equality invited me to a workshop for young activists in Houston, Texas. And they gave me money for a bus ticket from Washington, D.C. to Houston, Texas. And I took advantage of it, and my thinking was, well, I'll see the whole South. And I bought a ticket, Washington, Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Houston. And I got off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi, because, and this is now the summer of '62, yeah. And I got off the bus in Jackson, Mississippi because the students in Jackson were sitting in. And my thinking was that it's one thing for me to be sitting in Maryland and Virginia. It's something qualitatively different for students to be sitting in Mississippi, because at least for my generation, the state was wholly associated with the murder of Emmett Till, and we had been raised to believe that there was no place in the entire universe worse for a black person than the state of Mississippi. So my mind couldn't quite get together these students sitting in this place, and I wanted to see what kind of people they were. I thought maybe they had some kind of gene that I was missing that enabled them to do this in that place. And I made my way to their headquarters on Lynch Street, for those of you who know Jackson, remember Jackson, and told them pretty much what I'm telling you. And they listened. There was a group of them, Dory, Gia, Colia. And when I finished, one of these students, Lawrence Gia, who just finished at Tougaloo College, passed away recently, got up, and Gia is a big guy, and he kind of hovered over me and spoke to me full of disdain. And he said, and I remember the words exactly, he said, "You're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights. What's the point of that when you're standing right here in Mississippi?" And it was a challenge. I got the message. Then another one of these students, who's also passed away not too long ago, Jesse Harris, chimes in, and he says, and again, I remember what Jesse said. He said, "Yeah, Charlie, you're in the war zone here." And what's coming through to me is that these guys are getting ready to go up into the Mississippi Delta to begin this SNCC project up there around voter registration. And they're saying, well, you can go to Texas and chatter about civil rights if you want to. But if you're serious, you'll hang with us and join our efforts, which is what I did because it was summer. And I had the summer. I didn't feel that I had to go to this workshop, not with these guys kind of hovering over me. And Dory Ladner was there too. I forget what Dory said, and Coley Liddell was there. I forget what Coley said. So I did. I decided to spend the summer with them, and I go up to Rouville, Mississippi. And what I didn't know was if you'd made that kind of decision, you couldn't at the end of the summer then say, well, it's been an interesting summer, thank you very much. But I got classes that are starting in September. So I stayed. I didn't really get out of the state for 4 or 5 years. And I think there are a lot of SNCC people that have that kind of story, because embedded in this story is an important fact about the movement, and that is, as much as it is involved in challenging white supremacy and racism and segregation and all of that, it's also defined, and perhaps more importantly defined, by the challenges black people made to one another within the black community, because that's what Giat is doing to me. Giat would later become the head of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, but he's challenging me. He says, stay here with us. And I wound up going to a little bitty town with two guys, Charles McLaurin, who's still up that way, and Landy McNair, who's out in California now. And Rouville, 1,100 people. And what I remember about the lots of things, you have to imagine, I'm a guy, I went to high school in Massachusetts and junior high school in Massachusetts, and Washington, D.C. is my hometown. And now I'm in this really remote, rural Mississippi town in the heartland of the Delta. Rouville had 1,100 people. And on my first, it was 2 days after we got there, and I remember we're walking down a dirt road and a car pulls up beside us. This white guy jumps out. He's got a pistol, and he says, I know, and again, you remember all this stuff word for word. He says, I know y'all ain't from here, and you're here to cause trouble. I'm here to tell you to get out of town. And he orders us in his car. Well, this guy turns out to be the mayor of Rouville. But he's not only the mayor, he's the head of the White Citizens Council. He is the owner of the biggest business in town, which is the hardware store. He broadcasts the agricultural news on the local radio station. And we find out because we get in he orders us at gunpoint into his car. When Max says, why do we have to get in the car? He says, because this pistol says so. And we find out when we get down to City Hall that he's also the Justice of the Peace. So I'm trying to figure out what universe now have I wandered into. I know about police brutality and that stuff. I never got stopped at gunpoint by a mayor of any place and told to get out of town like it was a cowboy movie. And he lectures us. I'll spare you the lecture, except he called us New York City communists and told us we needed to go back to New York because in those days, the worst kind of communists were those from Cuba, those from China, and those from New York City. And I'll leave all that. This is a great learning process for me. I'm in this universe, and what I have to figure out, you can only do two things in this kind of world. You can say, no, this is not the place for me, and get out. Or you can decide to stay. If you stay, you've got to figure out then how to navigate this place. And learning how to navigate in this kind of place is what gave me skills that would prove extremely useful in my later life. I've been a working reporter, a journalist, all of my working life. And what I had to do in Rouville and places like that was learn how to listen to people and learn how to speak to people. Because you had to learn that. There's nothing in my experience that up till then that it taught me how to function in a place like Sunflower County, in a little bitty town like Rouville, Mississippi. And I learned quickly that the people that I was living among, black people, they knew when they were in danger and they knew when they were not in danger in ways that you didn't. And the only way to figure that out was to learn to listen to people. I'll tell you one quick story to illustrate this, and then be quiet. At the end of a dirt road where we lived, in a section of town called the Sanctified Quarters, a rather elderly lady named Mrs. Anderson ran a little what would be called a convenience store then. And if we were walking down this dirt road on a hot day, Mrs. Anderson would wave us over and say something like, it's kind of hot out here. Why don't you boys sit down right here and let me go inside and get something cold to drink? She had a pecan tree in front of her little store and a wooden bench that we could sit down. And after a while, we realized that she always went into the store. She never told us to go into the store. And we figured that she was afraid that if we went into the store, the white people would figure we were up to something and come by and maybe blow up her store. So the way she reconciled how to deal with us was to have us sit on this bench while she went in this store. And then one afternoon, she waved us over as she usually did. And Mrs. Anderson was a gossip. So she knew everything. And she would tell us things like, well, Charlie, the white people were talking about you last night. And you need to be careful. They know you're going to do. I don't know how Mrs. Anderson knew this stuff. But she knew all this stuff. And would tell us. She had her own network. And we learned to pay attention to what she was saying. And then our big breakthrough, I always tell people, to Rouville came when one afternoon Ms. Anderson waved us over, she usually did, and sat us down, and then said, "Why don't one of you boys go inside and get something cold to drink?" And Mac or me went inside and got a soft drink or something like that. It was a big break. And I don't know that Mrs. Anderson ever tried to register to vote. But later, I asked Mrs. Anderson, this is months later, I said, "Well, how come you were so nice to us? Why'd you feel that you had to offer us these soft drinks?" And she told us something I learned was really important about organizing. She reminded me that Amzie Moore, the head of the local NACP, had brought us into the community not at the head of a protest march, but had brought her to her church, Mount Galilee Missionary Baptist Church, and introduced us to the congregation. And she said, when Mr. Moore introduced you to the congregation, I knew if you were important to Mr. Moore, that you'd be important to me, and I ought to pay attention to what you boys were doing in town. And she didn't, she wasn't going to go all the way for us. It was really dangerous in those days to go down to the county courthouse and try and register to vote. But her contribution to what we were doing was to make sure we had those cold Coca-Colas or knee-high grapes on a hot summer day. And as I said, I don't know that she ever tried to register to vote. I do know that she knew a lot of stuff that was going on in town, and we might have wound up dead if we hadn't been paying attention to what Mrs. Anderson was saying, and that what I learned was these were the people you had to listen to if you were going to function in these communities in any way that enabled you to survive. I think people today don't understand at all how violent these communities were. These were places where you could be killed with impunity. And nobody, including the federal government, much cared. So you had to learn how to listen to these people. That's the big lesson that I learned in Mississippi. It's the big lesson that I left Mississippi with. And it's the big lesson that enabled my career as a reporter for news agencies, finding himself in various parts of the world where I didn't have a clue about what was going on. Yeah.
I didn't want to go. I was perfectly happy. I was a campus organizer for the Young Christian Students, which is a Catholic social action organization trying to get students to get out of their Catholic bubble and engage in the world. And so I had met some SNCC freedom riders and sit-in people at a student conference, totally impressed by them, and decided I'm going to go around on campuses and I'm going to be talking about how important it is to support this Southern movement, either money or bodies. However, we need to support this Southern movement. So then I get a letter from a woman who worked for SNCC in the Atlanta office, who I had met at another student conference. And like Judy, because I could type 90 to 100 words a minute and knew shorthand, she wanted me to come down and work in the office. And I'm like, no, they beat people up down there. There's flying cockroaches down there. They get in your hair. And I'm just like, I'm not doing this. So this letter stayed in the bottom of my suitcase for, I don't know, probably 2-3 months. And finally I'm like, what a hypocrite. Every time you come to a campus, you're talking to them about how important it is to support the Southern movement, and you're asked to go down and you're going to say no. And on top of it, I'm running into these nuns on these different campuses that think the sit-ins are communist, which is like, this is the church that needs to be defeated in my mind. But I'm not going, I'm not going south. Finally, of course, Catholic guilt won over, and I found myself on a bus going south. And got diverted to a program that was a really interesting and important program because there were young kids, 13 to probably in their early 20s, that on the one TV that was in their block, they would see students doing sit-ins on the TV, on the nightly news, or they would see, the Freedom Riders, or they would see Jet Magazine or whatever. And they would just do their own little sit-ins and get thrown into jail. Some of them gotten beaten up really bad. And so SNCC and a couple of other organizations were saying, we need to pull some of these young people into Atlanta for the summer. Let's talk to them about nonviolent strategy. Let's talk to them about Black history. Let's talk to them about a lot of different things. So I got roped into being on staff. I think they needed a mom or something, a woman that would bandage up people if they got scraped up or whatever. I don't know why, but I did. And it's one of the things that just stood with me then for the next 4 or 5 years. Several components in the curriculum for that summer, it was a 6-week summer program, was Black history. And I watched these kids as they learned Black history, just heads come up, eyes just get big but focused, and it was like there was a whole different way they walked after that. And I'm like pissed because I'm a college graduate and I never knew this stuff. Somehow I felt duped and robbed of a full education because, I didn't know this. So that imprinted me a lot. And in the process of being a part of this program, we invited in SNCC organizers, and Frank Smith and Bernard Lafayette came from Selma to talk to the students about what was going on in Selma. And Frank, in good kind of SNCC, listened real tight, we had lunch, and he said, so where'd you come from? How come you're coming down here? And I talked about YCS, and I talked about, Catholic social justice stuff. And he said, oh. He said, Bernard Lafayette's coming in from Selma tomorrow. We should have lunch. And I said, okay. And so we did. And after we had a conversation, they said to me, we think you should go to Selma. And inside me, I'm going, no friggin' way am I going to do this. At least I'm safer in Atlanta than going into Selma, and I am not going to do this. But I don't say this out loud because here's these two warriors, who've been through all the stuff that they've been through, and here's this chicken shit lady saying no. So they said, yeah, we're going to go talk to Ruby Doris and Jim Foreman and see, we think you should do this because there is a Catholic pastor of the Black Catholic Church in Selma. And he's really important to the movement because he's one of the only ones who can open his church because he's not working for the white man in Selma, He has his own salary coming from someplace else, Rome, whatever. And we're Baptist and you're Catholic, and we need you to go in there and do what he wants because he has to stay solid with us. And I'm just thinking, what the hell did I get myself into? So of course, Ruby Doris and Jim think this is a great idea. And somehow I found myself on a plane going into Selma and meeting Father Ouellette and then deciding, I guess I could do this. And I want to say, there's lots of lessons I learned because I've been organizing most of my life. I stayed in Mississippi, I stayed in the whole Black Belt South till 68 and then went to New Mexico and worked in the land grant movement and other kinds of movements. But organizing is about the invitation. It's not about mass meetings and great leaders and beautiful posters and wonderful speeches. It's about somebody saying, I watched you draw something, and we really could use you in the movement. And could you come work with us? And that invitation is what built the movement. So I think I'll stop here.
I'm curious for either any of you all's perspective on, and we've had sort of private conversations about this, but sort of the evolution of language. Charlie, you talked about it. Maria, you talked about it as well. to the movement, the way that you all communicated your message to people who had to put their life on the line, and how that can kind of, what would you impart to particularly young activists today when many of them are kind of grappling with getting more people on board with whatever form of activism that they're taking?
Well, I think in the rural South, where rural Mississippi is where I mostly worked for all those years that I worked with SNCC. And I think what I learned, people in the rural South, in rural communities, may not have, in fact, did not have a great deal of reading, writing literacy, but they had a great deal of people literacy. They knew how to measure and judge people, whether or not you were serious. The same way they had to make various kinds of judgments about the weather, about the crops, about whether or not the sheriff and his deputies, or whoever that had power, was dangerous at any particular moment or any particular point of contact. So they were judging you, and they took their time doing that. They were expert. They could tell if you weren't serious. And here, I think, in figuring this out, Ella Baker is an important name, because Miss Baker, and she was Miss Baker to us because she was 59 years old when we met her. Miss Baker had, right from the start of her interaction with SNCC, told us to keep our eyes and ears to the ground, to listen to what people were telling us, and that we'd learn more from what people were telling us than teaching people what we knew. I mean, I think this is a much more complicated discussion than we have time for here at this particular forum. But I feel compelled to make some reference here to the influence of Miss Baker. So we almost right from the start knew we'd have to move slow. That you know, in these little towns, you knew right away that things that we knew about, like sit-ins or freedom rides, whatnot, weren't going to be particularly useful in these little towns and counties. We knew that right from the start, and that you had to move slow. So you learned, you went to church with people, you know, you ate in people's houses because people didn't have money, but they could more often than not feed you. You helped out with chores that had to be done. I remember at one point in Rouville, I decided, being from up north, that I would try and pick some cotton with people. And I told Mr. McDonald, who I was staying with, that I would go out in the fields with people. You had these long bags that you had to drag behind you, and I marched out in the field with the folk, and I didn't last an hour. But what it meant was, in terms of the organizing dynamic, was then I became the topic of everybody's conversation. Do you know that guy? That was everybody. And at some level, they appreciated the effort because they had low expectations from me to start with. But I think that's how you work in these communities. I mean, and you talk to people, and you know, and they are curious about you. They want to know, well, what's Washington, D.C. like? Did you meet the president? There's a level of curiosity you're interacting with. They want to know what Miss Baker used to. They were asking you what Miss Baker used to call the "Who are your people?" questions. You know, because they're taking a measure of you, and if you're organized, you learn that that's what's going on fairly quickly, and you also learn. And again, this is Miss Baker's influence, I think. You know, whatever's going to emerge will emerge from the power that the local people exercise. So you're consciously trying to create situations in which people can feel their own power. Ms. Hamer used to tell us that one of the things she liked about us was that at any meeting, somebody from SNCC would always turn to her and say, "What do you think about that, Mrs. Hamer?" And she's the first time the SNCC people, we were the first people who ever asked her what she thought about something. I mean, I think somewhere, again, this is a book. This is much more involved than I can talk about here at this mic at this time. But the point I want to make is you're sensitive and conscious that you're working with people around the idea of people finding their own strength, their own power. And you know it's not going to be fast. And Bob Moses used to say, you know, he used to always worry about, he said, about promising people too much too soon. That you really wanted to be, you weren't going to promise them the world. You just want to get people to see that they could begin to take control of their own lives. And that's a slow process, and it's a learning process.
SNCC kind of had a slogan. We went into communities to do what people wanted us to do. And so in Selma, when I went in 63, it was to do literacy, because the feeling is that people needed to learn to read, to fill out the 21 question test to register to vote. And so made the assumption about, non-readers and what they needed, and came out totally on the other end of that, like a year later. The assumption in terms of the literacy industry, which was primarily white in this country, was that readers, white and affluent, that's important because it wasn't just Black people and Latinos who were non-readers, it was also poor whites. The assumption is that they basically could only understand, you could only take them through real basic reading materials with monosyllabic words and then sequentially get them to a more difficult level where they could be independent in their reading, which was the state of education in this country at the time and still in many places in this country now, and totally wrong. Because these adults who were non-readers spoke in several syllables. They recognized certain words, and some of them big words. They just, so you couldn't do that. And most of the literacy materials were for almost childlike and had white middle-class families as their illustrations. And people just were not going to be shamed like that. And even though we knew there was this rumble through the community about people need to learn to read, very few people would show up for the literacy. It was just too shameful. And it took a lot of listening to realize, and I'm still learning how I evolved in this. Going through my papers this week has been a total bomb in my mind in terms of assumptions that I've made about this period. But we came out the other end realizing that the best people who could break down information, because that's what it was about, who could break down information for other people in these communities was the people themselves. And so, because I would listen to somebody talk, for example, there was a okra co-op in northern Mississippi called the Batesville or the Panola Okra Co-op. And there were farmers in Alabama and farmers in other parts of Mississippi that wanted to know how to do this. Well, I could have written that up. And luckily for me, I started listening to the way those farmers, because we bring people together in meetings around other things, and I'd listen, overhear these conversations Well, how'd y'all do that? Well, how'd you get the money? Well, what did you do about the white? And I'm listening to the response, and it was broken down very concretely, very clearly, almost visually, in terms of how that information was transmitted. And I'm sitting here thinking, why should I learn about how to do co-ops and create? I mean, I'm just going to tape folks. And we did that. We taped people. We edited what they said. We brought it back to them and said, now, is this what you said? Does this really communicate this? Most importantly, we did really good visuals, because there was nothing in this period of time that showed Black people taking leadership in their communities, having these competencies, having these skills, nothing, which I know I still am astounded about. Anyway, the first 2 books we did were on the Batesville Co-op, and the response it blew me away, because I thought, well, this makes some logical sense. But you go to mass meetings, and the organizer would say to me, don't ever distribute these books before we start the meeting, because we can't get people back to the meeting, because they're just like going through this book. And one farmer said, I haven't read anything in such a long time, and I don't know why it's just easy for me to read this. And I got a letter from a woman in Louisiana that said, please send me some of these, because I'm going to stand up at our next meeting and I'm going to read it to everybody. So people use them in different ways. And I didn't know, this is not anything that came whole cloth out of my mind. This is my learning, like Charlie said, by listening to people and realizing who the real teachers were in this setting. And it sure as heck wasn't us.
So my next question then is, in terms of both your work then and your work today, we have established authors, documentarians, you're working in film, you're working in photography. From an activist perspective, particularly for the younger generation who are sort of have their hands on the plow right now. See what I did there? Oh,
Nice.
totally off the top. No, but talk about how critical it is for the activists themselves to be able to tell the story, and whether it's through film, whether it's through photography, whether it's through writing. How critical is it for you to record the history as it's happening? Well, we have a few minutes left. I want to first thank our wonderful panel. If we can give them a round of applause. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. We all go to these wonderful panels all the time, and we have these extremely effervescent and intelligent and wonderful speakers, and you all have no idea if anything you said hit a mark with anyone in the room. So I'm going to ask if someone or anyone who may have a question, but before you ask a question, tell our panel what resonated with you this evening.
Nice idea.
I always do that. It's just a thing. No pressure. Yes.
I was struck by your story about the tea or the Coca-Cola.
Oh,
Right.
Mrs. Anderson.
Yes, Mrs. Anderson, who knew all of the town gossip. Because I think that sometimes we forget, or we sometimes judge people who aren't, in the fight, directly taking direct action and everything. And I think what resonated for me is that when anyone's working for human rights or even community organizing at the local level, we need to be more attentive to those around us who are providing for our needs and allowing us to take care of ourselves. So I just think you gave me more time to reflect, especially with your anecdote, on when I'm doing an activity, who's there doing the essential everyday things.
Let me just say very quickly, and I'm really borrowing a bit from Bob Moses, who was the project director for SNCC, in Mississippi, there's a level, in which we, the SNCC people, and I would argue the core people, there's really no fundamental difference between the SNCC people and the core people down on the ground in Mississippi or Louisiana or wherever people were. We were really kind of the community's children. And people took it on themselves to look out for us. Now, not a lot of people were going to be prepared to go as far as we would have liked, say around voter registration, actually going to the county seat, the heartland of white supremacy, to try and register to vote. But people did within the framework of their concerns, and the concerns range from fear and the necessities of survival and work and whatnot, to support us in the way almost a family would support its children. We were really, in some ways, and I don't think I'm romanticizing this, the community's children. So Mrs. Anderson, I tell her story to reflect that in part. Mrs. Anderson, as far as I know, never tried to register to vote, at least while I was working in that part of Mississippi. But she was prepared to do what she thought could be helpful to us. Because after all, Amzie Moore had brought us to her church. And that was to give us information she thought would keep us safe. And this operated in lots of different ways. One, Unita Blackwell, who would eventually become the mayor of Myersville, her husband told her, Ms. Unita was the leader of the Issaquah County movement, right? As far as I know, her husband never tried to register to vote. And I asked him one day, I said, well, what are you going to try and register to vote? And here was what his answer was. He said, well, Charlie, I know y'all are nonviolent, and I'm not going down to that courthouse without my pistol. And one of these white people messes with me down at that courthouse, I'm going to shoot him. I'm going to try and kill him. And he says, I know that'll get you in trouble. So I'm not going down there. That was how he supported the movement. He didn't tell his wife not to support us. He never prevented us from eating food in his house, or her from running for office finally and winning as the mayor of Myersville. So people gave their support in ways they felt they could. And that's, I think, is important, because I think you'd find the same thing today for all the differences if you tried to organize in places like Chicago or South Los Angeles or Indianapolis, although the dynamic would be different. There are people there who, as E.W. Steptoe told Bob Moses, who would tell you, I've been expecting you.
Can I just mention, just to riff off Charlie, there is the themes that all of us have been talking about, and that idea that people are doing things unseen and supporting you in ways that you may not know. There is a wonderful feature film called Freedom Song. Yes. Now, I mention that everywhere I go because I know the documentary stuff, but the guy who did, Phil Alden Robinson, who did Field of Dreams, if they build it, you will come, or if you build it, they will come. Anyway, he was the director of that. And he also did a wonderful 90-minute feature film with Danny Glover, Loretta Devine, and every black film star you ever knew in their best roles. And what you see is the Macomb movement. And what Phil Alden Robinson did is he went into Macomb, and with Bob Moses and some of the organizers in Macomb, he did interviews with the Macomb people. Oh, there's a train. Oh, okay. Yes, that's right.
That's the Freedom Train.
That's the Freedom Train. Oh, go ahead. That was well done. That's right. That's right. But I give DVDs when I do teacher training, because you can get Freedom Song. I hate to send people to Amazon because they're horrible people. But if you go on Amazon for $8 and some cents, you get this 90-minute DVD. You see what happens when SNCC goes into Macomb. You see the Brenda Travis walkout. You see all the stuff that is real. It's not like made up, right?
A 3-day meeting.
The 3-day meeting, the 3-day SNCC meeting. You see that really, and it's all well done. And you see the father, that is kind of a, composite character. But the father who does the same thing, it's like he's trying to stop his son. Because his thing is, okay, if you want me to get my gun, I can do that. But if you don't want to do that, then don't put my son in this then. All of that is in Freedom Song. So y'all should get Freedom Song. Okay.
This might be unfair because I get to work with y'all on a regular basis. But I was struck by, Varela, when you said the comment about Frank Smith coming to talk to you, and you said that he really listened, like SNCC, and then you looked over at Charlie and Judy, and they both gave you this knowing nod. And so I was wondering what that meant internally in SNCC. What was that listening that looked like within SNCC amongst your peers as an organization?
Well, I think when Maria tells that story, I don't see it as particularly very different from the story I tell about Giat and Jesse Harris.
You got rougher with you than Frank got with me.
Yeah, but still, it's fundamentally the same story, which is one, young people challenging other young people to do something. I think what's really different about the 1960s, not like civil rights struggle was somehow came into existence in the 1960s and it never happened before. What's really significant about the 1960s is the emergence of young people into positions of leadership in the movement. I know when I saw the student sit-ins on television, I was a 12th grader, and I'm looking at John Lewis and Diane Nash and them in Nashville. I'm looking at Julian and them in Atlanta because these sit-ins were televised. It's the first time I realized that civil rights was something that people my own age could do. Up until then, civil rights was something that grown-ups did. So this is something significant that begins unfolding in 1960, February 1, right up the road here, down the road, over in Greensboro, when the students sit in. This emergence of young people, not just as activists, but as movement leaders. And they're challenging other young people, because that's, if you talk to people, think about it. February 1, 1960, sit-ins happened in Greensboro. In 2 months, they've spread to 80 southern cities. Students are being challenged by other students right across the South, in much the same way that Frank and Bernard are challenging Maria.
No, they're inviting me. I kind of.
There's a difference. Yeah.
There's a difference.
I don't.
That's the way men
She
do
heard
it.
it. She heard it as an invitation.
Yeah,
You
men.
may
There's
have-
There is
a difference.
there is.
There's a tender thing.
There's never been a shortage of argument in cities. I don't see it that way.
Right.
I think challenge. My point is that I see challenges of young people by other young people, challenges of black people by other black people, is an important piece of how SNCC in particular and civil rights struggle in general in the 1960s emerged. And I don't see a great deal of difference between Giat, given his personality, challenging me to work with them, and Frank and Bernard inviting
Okay.
Maria.
I would have run away
to
if it had been a challenge. If Giat would have done that to me, I would have
Yes.
said, okay.
You got it. Because it is different. It is different.
Because
But
they were really listening
yes.
to me.
yes, they were. They were.
They
And
were
let me.
getting me.
And that's what I wanted to say, because I got a sense from your question.
Get up on you.
I got a sense from your question. I got a sense from your question that you were also asking another kind of question, which is internally within this culture of SNCC, how are we doing this? And I will say that I do think that the way we operated in SNCC, we were youth-led, we were Black-led, we were Southern-led in many ways. And there was a culture of listening to each other. Did not mean we didn't do this, which is why when you see Freedom Song, you will see 3-day meetings. But what was amazing to me is that I never felt disrespected in SNCC. I never felt that people were doing like Trump, that, you were never personally attacking me. Now, you might be a woman Say I was going out with your boyfriend. Okay, so you might have a personal, because you remember we were 19, 20 years old. Okay, you might have a personal thing about that, but that would not come out because bottom line, we had each other's back because people were trying to kill you. So the main thing was, how do you protect one another? When we talked about a band of brothers and sisters and a circle of trust, the reason we've been, 50 years, we have known each other and been friends for 50 years. Part of that was because it was all about the work. When we did the 52 women, SNCC women in Hands on the Freedom Plow, it took us 15 years to get this done. Now, Barella's in here, I'm in here, 52 SNCC women's. It's 52 SNCC women's. That's right. We said 52 SNCC women's. The reason, what you find with all of these people is that you will get the sense of arguments, disagreements. But the main part was that we were this band of brothers and sisters in a circle of trust. And the way, and in some ways, it didn't prepare you for some of the stuff you went outside. It's what Vietnam vets call in the world, right? Well, when we went out in the world, I assume people are going to respect me and that they're going to listen to me and they're not going to attack me personally. When I was saying, well, somebody, anyway, it was a different environment. And in some ways, when we come back together again, that's what we recreate. We recreated it the last year at the 50th. We did it at the 40th. When we come back together, we recreate this circle. And it's amazing to me. Yeah.
I'm a teacher, and there's something that happens sometimes, and it's the thing I live for. And Judy, you articulated it just right. And I wanted to I wrote it down. You said of your time in SNCC, it changed who I was and who I wanted to be. I found out that there could be another way. That's the moment, that you're waiting for. And it's not the passage of the Voting Rights Act, but it creates a permanent change. So there's another piece I wanted to mention, which is Charlie's invocation of learning how to listen and how to speak to people. And then Ms. Varela has talked about the heart of organizing is about the invitation, where you notice people's gifts and say, we could use you in the movement. All of those things are tender and human in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to ask, and I know how important that is, but when people are hungry for social change, I think they imagine something more dynamic, right? And how do you explain to people what's the relationship between those desires and necessities?
I think it works in different ways with different groups of people. For instance, the young people, certainly in the towns, cities in Mississippi, towns really, say in Greenville, another place I worked, then a city of 30,000, I think, 25 or 30,000. And this was Bob's experience in Macomb, a city of 15,000, I think, when he went in 1961. Young people wanted sit-ins. That's what they want, and the pressure was on for that. McLaurin and I felt the same thing in Greenville. In fact, the students, much as the students did in Macomb, just had the sit-ins. And then we saw they were getting arrested. That's when we sort of discovered they were sitting in and wound up getting arrested ourselves. That's another story. So that's one age group. At the same time, people like Amzie Moore, older people, they didn't want sit-ins. Amzie sat Bob Moses down and basically said, I admire this energy I'm seeing in the student sit-in movement. Y'all are sitting in and freedom rides hadn't happened, the sit-ins, but I'm not interested in having that in my little town. And it turned out Amzie had a whole plan for voter registration. and he brings that to SNCC's second conference in October. That's a different age group. So it depends on what set of people you're talking to, and they range from people like students who want to do really radical direct action to more conservative establishment type leaders like Dr. Stringer, who was before Aaron Henry, the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, who really wanted to move very, very cautiously in the state. And I think probably much the same thing is true today. I mean, certainly when you take a look at the response, say, to groups like Black Lives Matter, you certainly get a range of responses.
I'm really talking to somebody who works with young people who want to do something dramatic and radical and now, and they expect a lot of fireworks. And then the difference between that and the kind of slow and patient organizing that Joan was talking about, which has a wonderful human appeal that I think would touch anybody, but it doesn't necessarily speak to what angry 20-year-olds want. And so I guess I'm fishing for wisdom about how to. You don't want to come off as trying to damp people down just because some other things need to be done. But I wondered if, and actually, Charlie did a good job.
Just remember that before we got into this slow, quiet organizing work in Mississippi, we all came out of the sit-in movement.
Yes,
You know, we were getting arrested and going into all these places. You know, it wasn't as if we sort of quietly sat around and said, let's do voter registration or something.
I think mentoring was really, really important, and we were so fortunate in whether it was AMSI or whether it was, other of the folks that had been involved in movement building after World War II, whether it was Miss Baker, and the fact that they related to us with respect, but somehow mentored us to see. I don't know. There's some steps there. It's a good question. There's some steps there that sometimes I think it's hard to see those steps that it took.
And I think part of it is when we had that voting rights conference here, what was interesting is when Umi, who used to be Phil Agnew, and now Umi coming out of Trayvon Martin, and he said, you won't see us on social media anymore, and you're not going to see us on Twitter, and we're not going to do any of this stuff for the next 2 months, 2 or 3 months, which was true. That's what he did. And he said, because we have to figure out as an organization how we do real grassroots community organizing, how we bed in. We started as a protest group. When I was in St. Louis, and it was, maybe a few months after Ferguson, and I'm talking to Organization of Black Survival. And this is a group of 20 years, and they've been doing grassroots organizing. And they say to me, the problem is we have these young guys who say, we don't want to hear, this stuff about organizing. We want to protest, and we don't want to know about the history either. Because the history doesn't mean anything to us. And besides which, y'all didn't do nothing anyway, so we're not going to listen to you. So you get a lot of stuff that we may not have always, but I will say that that I think there are people who are doing this. And I think it's all the stuff that they're saying, which is, look, back then, my thing was, I want to get arrested. I want to go to Mississippi. I'm sitting up in the national office. I want to go to Mississippi because that's where the action is. Okay. And so Foreman, I had to get a ticket to go to Mississippi when Foreman was off doing anti-apartheid conference in London. And somebody got me a ticket so I could go to Greenwood, Mississippi, right? So even back then, there were those of us, that was the badge of courage to get arrested, But I think at a certain point, like Phil, like Umi, you realize, oh, this isn't quite getting us where we want. Yeah.
I think there's in some ways, Miss Baker was an extraordinary person.
Yes.
I don't know what that, who would be that now.
Right.
Miss Baker had a whole history organizing these NACP branches. She had a whole network across the South that she was able to plug us into in terms of her people that she had begun working with in the 1940s and this the 1960s when we were emerging. I have this image. I can remember Miss Baker sitting in the back of the room as we're going at each other with her because we all smoked and she had a mask on to
She had
keep
asthma.
the smoke
She had-
because she had asthma. Nobody was conscious and talking and smoking the cigarettes. She's had this extraordinary level of patience. She had this extraordinary network that sort of transcended the organizational differences. So if Bob Moses is sent to Amzie Moore by Ella Baker, what's important is that Ella Baker has sent him, not that he's coming from SNCC. Or what's important to Aaron Henry, the state president of the NACP, is that Ella Baker has sent him, not that he's coming from. This is one of these extraordinary people who appears in history for reasons you can't completely understand, even, and you wonder. I do, even now. I mean, who, given the various political currents among young people today, who would be that? And I don't have a good answer for that.
I think what's very scary is what Judy just said. There has been war on our young men since the Reagan years. We have black, brown, red, Asian men that have just been totally dumped on, and there doesn't seem to be any place for them. And organizing in cities where that is going on is nothing like what we did. And I just think, we have to be real straight on honest about that.
And I'm sorry. Yeah. I would also mention that when I said to this group from St. Louis, and we had Miss Baker who made sure we were grounded in the local community and local adults who could pull us back when we did stuff stupid, who could say, no, we don't want this here. We are feeding and clothing you, and no, we don't want this stuff here. It's like what Charlie was talking about. Now, when I talk about Miss Baker to this group, the first thing this woman says is, look, we don't have a Miss Baker. That's what you're saying. And in fact, they said, when we have the Martin Luther King Day, every January, right, the black folks from the suburbs come in and they call them the fur-coated ones. And they said the fur-coated ones come up in their limos and and they go to the church and they do their little regular Martin Luther King Day speaks, and then they leave and then they go back to the suburbs. So the kind of relation, fur-coat, I love that one, fur-coated ones. And so the relationship that Miss Baker made sure that we had within the local community who could really not just nurture us, but teach us and pull us back from stupid stuff is not necessarily happening now. Yeah.
I think we have one more, and then we'll end. The concept about the movie being an invitation was probably, and I think you mentioned that also. That was one of the big takeaways. Also, just the courage that everyone displayed in being faced with a decision where you could have stepped back and stayed in Atlanta or went along to Texas and things like that. And the courage that it takes to face that, make that decision and participate. I think it's one of the things that I really took away and appreciate y'all sharing with us. I think as a segue in what y'all were just talking about, what would it look like if you were that person you were then now? So if you were now in your 20s, what type of enthusiasm would y'all have? What would you be doing? What would be the most important issues that you would be looking to tackle and face? Who would you look to align to? And what type of moves would you be making now?
Over to you.
I'd be working with the defenders. They're awesome to me because of the way they think through
Dream
what
Defenders.
they want to do, the Dream Defenders.
That came out of
They are picking up our mental in a lot of ways. And so for me personally, I would be doing that.
And yeah, just explain that. That's when I mentioned UMI. That's the.
Well,
Florida.
these are the young
Yes.
kids that are brought to this country when they're maybe.
Oh, you're talking about United
There's-
We Dream,
No.
Whatever, the undocumented
There's several.
children.
and that's why I'm saying we need to clarify because the
Because I'm not going to
defenders.
just
There's
do
several.
one organization.
And that's what I'm saying we need to
because
clarify.
they're all over and they're really working on immigration issues. And they're really doing it. They first started doing it for themselves because, and then they went through what we went through in a sense of it's not just about a hamburger now. It's about whole families. And talking about, keeping families together and talking about immigration and their leaders. They are just developing such leaders, and they study SNCC. SNCC is really something that inspires them because, in fact, there was this thing on YouTube that made me cry today, and that is there was a protest at ICE, what's that called?
Immigration and
Immigration, that by undocumented students from Georgia State, and
yes,
freedom singers went and joined them and
SNCC
sang
freedom
with them.
singers.
SNCC freedom singers.
Emory and Emory and
Yeah.
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 So
the two.
I think that we need the energy of immigrants. I mean, these are people, I have seen whole towns refurbished because of immigrants that have come in and started businesses, and, there's a whole rural America, in a sense, would be just, I'm not being very articulate right now, but these folks are important to this country, just as immigrants for the last 400 years have been important to this country. And they're really getting an extremely raw deal, especially in terms of what's happening with the children. So that's the movement I would be working with.
I think if I was the 19-year-old self that got on a bus to go to Texas and got hijacked by the Mississippians, the issue today that would most directly concern my 21st century 19-year-old self would be police violence. Would be the issue that I think would be roughly equivalent to kind of the sit-in and the segregation that you confronted in public accommodations. And I would probably, therefore, get on the bus to make my way to some conference somewhere about that. And that, what would engage me probably would be the question of then, one, I would quickly learn that what we were up against in terms of police violence is systemic oppression. So then how do you tackle these systems that are in place would lead me directly to not the struggle for voter registration, but the struggle for voter usage. I mean, because you look at Ferguson back when 2 years ago, only 6% of the eligible black voters voted in the municipal elections in Ferguson. It wasn't that they were denied voter registration, they hadn't been mobilized to use the vote. So I think but you can never tell. I mean, I don't know,
So true.
You're trying to figure
That's
out
too
what
rational of a question.
what I would be like today, as a 19-year-old, as opposed to 1961 as a 19-year-old. In the final analysis, I don't know.
It's always about the invitation and who invites you.
Yes, it is. And just so, I mean, just to clarify one thing, which is that what was amazing to me when we did this voting rights conference with the young people here was how many different things people were working on and how many points of view they had. So when you saw Christina Jimenez from United We Dream, she's bringing in all the immigration rights stuff. And then when you saw Umi from Dream Defenders, who's coming out of Trayvon Martin, he's bringing his stuff in. And I think what's amazing to me is that in many of the cases, at least of the people we saw, not all of them, but they're like with Christina, who, by the way, invited 2 of the SNCC people to come to their regional conference because they really do, it's what Varela is saying, they really do look, because we were their age. I mean, that's the difference. SCLC was black ministers, they were older. NAA was older and they were legal. We were their age. And we had a different point of view, mainly because of Ms. Baker. When you look at the young people, a lot of them are looking at us because of that, but there are they are looking systemically, and I think earlier than we did. We got to that. But you hear them and you see them talking about systemic change. And that's amazing to me. Yeah.
The point should be made that I think, thinking back to the early 60s, there's much more young activism and thought about activism today than there was 50 some odd years ago. There just is qualitatively and quantitatively different.
Your most important issue might be if you were to think back and be that.
Oh, I was hoping you'd forget I hadn't said anything. Okay. I'd probably be doing film then. I mean, what I found is that, and I'm not sure what I'd do it with, but I do think I've now gotten into this visual thing, and, it was Eyes, and then it was Slave Catchers, Slave Resistors. I did 3 films on slavery. It was like, oh, please. But I think the visual thing is really important to me, and education, and so somehow I've gotten into that part of it, and for me that's where my activism comes out. And I don't know what I would focus on, but I'm thinking about what Charlie said. Because the police brutality. When I worked for his daddy at the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, okay, it was in New York City, and we were at the corner, we were in Midtown Manhattan, and it was Eleanor Bumper, 67 years old, shot to death over an eviction by Officer Sullivan. It was Howard Beach. It was Michael Stewart, 24 years old, beaten to death by transit cops because he had gotten over the turnstile in New York, right? So I saw the police brutality stuff, and I also saw why chronologies are important. Now, again, Jack Minnis, head of research, it made a difference when I then went back 9 years, 10 years, and when I sent it out to the press, and it wasn't just those, in the last year, it was all the ones going back. You got it. So that you see the systemic nature. It's not just this one cop who hasn't had enough sensitivity training, right? It is because it's systemic. It's part of the air they breathe, right? So how do you change that? I think I would do a film probably related to that, but I would storytell it, because now I've learned that you really do have to bring people in that way. Yeah.
This was great. I enjoyed it.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.